This top 5 here is going to be comfort food for the 80s kid's soul. Although you won't have to have been a child of the 80s to appreciate these forgotten musical artists of that decade that probably should get remembered more. I had a lot of fun going through and finding these artists, listening to some of their music and remembering how much I enjoyed it or how much I still do enjoy it. Some of these artists are still in rotation in my musical playlist to this day. So as with most of these top 5 lists, they're in no particular order, and there are some honorable mentions to kind of get your mind ready for the top 5 itself. What I'm going to do differently with these honorable mentions is give you, in my opinion, the song these artists were most known for. So then if you want to pause the podcast after the top 5 and go make yourself a playlist on Spotify, you can. Okay, here we go. Honorable mentions for the top 5 forgotten musical artists of the 1980s include Bananarama, who sung Cruel Summer, Jody Watley, who sung Looking for a New Love, Billy Squier, who sung The Stroke, The Jets, who sung You Got It All, Fine Young Cannibals, who sung She Drives Me Crazy, Lisa and Cult Jam, who sung Lost in Emotion, and DeBarge, who sung Rhythm of the Night. Those people all had other hit songs, but those are the ones that I most associated with them. Maybe you've got different favorites, because this list isn't one-hit wonders, so all of these artists had at least 2, maybe 3 big hits. Did any of those artists bring back memories, get those songs playing in your head? Well, let's get ready and dive into the actual top 5, starting with number 1, Survivor. Most 80s kids, especially boys, will remember Survivor singing Eye of the Tiger in Rocky III. And yes, they also sung Burning Heart in Rocky IV, which both of those were big hits. Their 1984 album Vital Signs saw them get 2 other top 10 hit songs with High on You and The Search is Over. All in all, Survivor had 5 top 10 hits, including Eye of the Tiger that went to number 1. So that's pretty impressive for any band. But yet they're not really remembered much, except for maybe fans of the Rocky movies. But it did surprise me that they had 5 top 10 hits. Number 2 is Expose. They're an all-female group that was formed in Miami, Florida in 1984. Young girls and teenagers of the 1980s and into the early 90s will probably remember Expose. And if not, I'll just remind you with their list of hit songs, including Seasons Change, Let Me Be the One, Come Go With Me, Point of No Return, and I'll Never Get Over You Getting Over Me, although that was 1992, but still. Their 1987 debut album, Exposure, made them the first all-female group to have 4 top 10 hits on their debut album, including Seasons Change that went to number 1. The album went on to sell more than 2 million copies, and from 87 to 92, 93, Expose was one of the biggest groups in the world. And although I'll Never Get Over You Getting Over Me was another top 10 hit in early 1993, by that point, Expose had been passed by Wilson Phillips as the biggest female singing group in the world. Number 3 is Tears for Fears. They are an English pop rock band. They were formed in 1981. They hit the big time in 1985 with their album Songs from the Big Chair that yielded 2 number 1 singles, Shout and Everybody Wants to Rule the World. That latter song is probably one of the most famous 80s songs there is. That album alone has sold well over 9 million copies worldwide. They also had another top 5 hit in 1989 with the song Sowing the Seeds of Love. So for a time, they were one of the biggest bands in the world. But much like many of these other artists on this list, their fame seemed to quickly fade as the decade turned to the 90s. They had a minor hit, a top 40 hit in 1993 with Break It Down Again. But otherwise, Tears for Fears was gone from the main spotlight within a few years of the 80s ending. Number 4 is Roxette. They were a Swedish pop duo that formed in 1986. Their big breakthrough came in 1989 with their album Look Sharp, which included 2 number 1 songs, The Look and Listen to Your Heart. The Look Sharp album has sold more than 9 million copies worldwide, and that success only continued into the 90s. Their song It Must Have Been Love from the Pretty Woman soundtrack in 1990 became their 3rd number 1 song. They released their follow-up album Joyride in 1991, and that title song became their 4th number 1 single. The follow-up song Fading Like a Flower went to number 2. But after those dizzying highs, it quickly ended. And within a few years of that Joyride album, Roxette was basically a memory. And sadly, any reunions can't happen because sadly, singer Marie Fredriksson passed away in 2019 after battling cancer for 17 years. And finally, number 5 on the list of the top 5 forgotten musical artists of the 1980s is Taylor Dayne. She made her debut in 1987 and in total had 7 top 10 hits, including her debut song Tell It to My Heart, Love Will Lead You Back, Prove Your Love, With Every Beat of My Heart, and I'll Always Love You. The single Love Will Lead You Back actually went to number 1. And much like Exposé, much like Roxette, Taylor Dayne's popularity was late 80s into the early 90s, but quickly faded. In 1993, she released a cover of Barry White's Can't Get Enough of Your Love. That was a top 40 hit, but that was basically it. She's one that if you go and look at her catalog, especially if you've never heard of her, you younger listeners, you'd be surprised how many big hits she had in such a small period of time. But that'll wrap up the top 5. How many of these artists, whether in the top 5 or the honorable mentions, do you have on your playlists on Spotify, iTunes? I know I'm biased as a child of the 80s, but I had a lot of fun going through all these artists and listening to some of these songs. Like I said, chicken soup or comfort food for the 80s child soul.